When we walk with the Lord in the light of His word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. You're listening to That Other Life. I'm your host, Richard Haddad. Trust and Obey was written by John Henry Sammis. Today's topic is titled A Lesser Sin for a Greater Good, and I wanted to discuss whether good intentions can justify small sins. I was first confronted with this question when I was watching the play Les Miserables. We learned that the main character, Jean Valjean, is imprisoned for breaking into a house and stealing a loaf of bread. In his defense, Valjean says, "My sister's child was close to death, and we were starving." Everyone watching the play or reading the book would have compassion on Valjean and think maybe his crime is justifiable. He may have been the only hope for his niece or his nephew. And that's the question I was confronted with. On the one hand, I felt sorry for Valjean. I felt sorry for his niece or his nephew, and I felt sorry for their situation. But on the other hand, he broke the law. Now in his case, the law was irrational since it disregarded the poor completely. But I'm looking beyond that. And I wrestled with those two ideas. If someone commits a little crime to save someone so helpless, has he still committed a crime? And I guess that's what it all came down to for me. If you've committed a crime, be it for good or for evil, you've still committed a crime. The ends don't justify the means. If anything, the ends, however good they may be in themselves, have now been polluted. Moving away from Les Miserables, and by the way, I can't wait to hear my wife laugh at my French pronunciations, but there are many Christians who believe in this idea, that a good end will always justify the means, even if they're bad means. That a Christian is allowed to commit a little sin, or even that a Christian has to sin sometimes in order to do good or to come out with a good result. Now, not only is that untrue, but it's unbiblical. Think about those words. In order for me to do good, to do what God would be pleased with, I have to sin and do something shameful to Him, something that hurts Him, something that offends Him, something that Jesus had to die to clean me of. Did Jesus only die for big sins? No. This idea of the greater good is an Islamic teaching, not a biblical one. It's also an atheistic teaching where it's okay to kill a few, even if the few were in the millions, as long as it benefits the advancement of the human race. But nowhere in the Bible is it ever okay to do evil so that good may abound. In Genesis, when Joseph tells his brothers, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good," he's not saying you did God a favor. If you hadn't done the evil you did, God would have been out of options. He wouldn't have had a clue how to bring deliverance. Not at all. What Joseph is saying is that even though you meant it for evil, even though what you did was evil, God turned it around and He used it for good. Now, many believe that in the New Testament, Judas Iscariot was absolutely required for Jesus to be crucified. But I don't think he was. See, Judas put himself in that position. The crucifixion was the very reason that Jesus came to earth. Every step of His life on earth was carefully planned and was following a timely schedule. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 55, the chief priests and the elders send a massive crowd to go and seize Jesus. And this is what Jesus says to them. "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as you would against a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me." What's Jesus saying? He's saying that they had every opportunity to grab Him, but it wasn't His time yet. He didn't allow them to. There were many opportunities that they had. He tells them that He was preaching in the temples and they didn't seize Him. At one point they tried to throw Him off a cliff, but He got away. Why? Because there was a particular time that Jesus was going to die. And there was a particular way that Jesus had to die. The crucifixion. No one was forcing Him to do that. No one was forcing Him down that road. No one was pushing Him. No one was required so that Jesus would go there. That was the very reason that He came to earth. And He was going there by his own accord. He was going there by his own choice. Now that it was his time, he was handing himself over. That's the point that Jesus was making. Watch in verse 56. So this is Matthew chapter 26, same chapter, and verse 56. But all this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets. Even in his capture, Jesus was making sure that he fulfills the scriptures so that no one can have a justifiable doubt as to whether he was the Messiah or not. The prophecies were laid out clearly, and Jesus met each one perfectly. So what about Judas? Didn't he also fulfill prophecy? In Psalm chapter 41 verse 9, David writes, "Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." And Jesus quotes this verse almost exactly. In John chapter 13 verse 18, Jesus says, "I do not speak to all of you. I know the ones I have chosen. But it is that the scripture may be fulfilled. He who eats my bread has lifted up his heel against me." Notice how Jesus doesn't call Judas his close friend or say of Judas, "in whom I trusted." Jesus knew. It wasn't that he trusted Judas and was surprised by his actions. No, he knew. Okay, so should we say then that Judas was forced to betray Jesus? Absolutely not. See, the prophecies were given by God as a foreknowledge rather than a predetermination. Judas, on Judgment Day, will be judged because he chose to betray the Son of God, not because God was helpless or he was out of options and used Judas as a scapegoat. Remember, Jesus was handing himself over. No one was forcing him to. Judas just put himself in the picture. And God, knowing that ahead of time, gave David the prophecy and David wrote it. That way, anyone trying to put the two pictures together, the Old Testament prophecies and the New Testament fulfillment, would have no doubt that Jesus is the Messiah that the Old Testament spoke about. Had David never written about Judas, people may have said, "Hold up, Judas delivered Jesus. Where in the Old Testament does it say that someone would betray him or deliver him?" Well, it does. See, the Old Testament wrote of the events that would happen in the New Testament. Some things were done on purpose to fulfill the scriptures, and some things were just written in the Old Testament as a foreknowledge of what would happen in the New Testament. Now, we veered off the topic a little, but all this was to emphasize the point that God will never require us to sin in order for good to abound. If we go to 1 Samuel chapter 15, King Saul disobeys God's instruction and thinks he's done it for a very good reason. In verses 20 and 21, we read this: "Then Saul said to Samuel, I did obey the voice of the Lord, and I went on the mission on which the Lord sent me, and have brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took some of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the choicest of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal." Saul is telling Samuel that he knows clearly what God expected. And he knows that he's disobeyed God's instruction. But hey, God should be happy that we've decided to sacrifice all of these sheep and oxen to him. We didn't let them go to waste. Instead, we thought, let's sacrifice them to the Lord. Now, do you remember what Samuel's response to that was? Verses 22 and 23. Samuel says, "Has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." So, from this account, what do we understand of God's opinion on the matter? Do you think he expects us to sin in certain situations? Maybe the government is being unfair to us. Maybe the society around us is rough. Maybe our situation is incredibly troubling, and there seems to be no way out. Can we not tell a little lie to make it better? I mean, it's not for me. It's to help my family, or my niece, or my nephew, or whoever. That's always the excuse, right? It's never for me, it's always for the children. I'm doing a bad thing and taking the weight of it for the sake of the children. How good and how sacrificial I am. To obey is better than sacrifice. Rebellion is a sin just like witchcraft, and disobedience is evil and just like idol worship. So what then are we to do? When the situation is tough, what are we meant to do? Well, obey. Just obey. It isn't always easy. In fact, the situations that drive us to consider sin to get out of trouble are the situations that are toughest to obey in. But that's what we're called to do. To sin in order to get out of trouble is to tell God, I don't trust you. I don't think you have the power to get me out of this situation. I don't think you care enough for me to help me. To sin in order to get out of trouble is to rob God of his character. It is to call him a liar, that he doesn't keep his promises. It is to call him weak. It is to call him uncaring, unloving, unkind. It's to say that he is not God. That's what we're doing when we resort to sin instead of trusting and obeying him. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. There was another song that I wanted to use for this podcast, and I think I will mention it anyway. You get 2 songs today instead of 1. Francis Ridley Havergal wrote this song. It says, "Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Take my moments and my days, let them flow in ceaseless praise. Take my hands and let them move at the impulse of thy love. Take my feet and let them be swift and beautiful for thee. Take my voice and let me sing always only for my King. Take my lips and let them be filled with messages from thee. Take my silver and my gold, not a mite would I withhold. Take my intellect and use every power as thou shalt choose. Take my will and make it thine, it shall be no longer mine. Take my heart, it is thine own, it shall be thy royal throne. Take my love, my Lord, I pour, at thy feet its treasure store. Take myself and I will be ever only, all for thee. Let every part of me be in obedience of God. Let my mouth, my hands, my feet, my possessions, my will and my heart, all and always be dedicated to God, even and especially when the situation tests me to the point of hopelessness. Christ remains my hope. Even death couldn't keep him." Do you have any thoughts and opinions on this topic? Send them through to opinions@thatotherlife.com. That's opinions, OPINIONS, at thatotherlife.com. Thank you for listening. I'm Richard Haddad, and these have been my thoughts on That Other Life.